Pleasure is the most silent form of imprisonment. No one needs to put chains on you when they can make you crave what weakens your mind. Napoleon Hill exposed this in a brutal way in Outwitting the Devil. The enemy doesn't start by destroying your life with tragedy. It starts by offering comfort. A little more food, a little more distraction, a little more desire, a little more money without wisdom, a little more pleasure without control. And before you realize it, you're no longer making decisions. You're just reacting to your impulses. That's the part almost no one wants to face. Most people are not trapped because they failed. They're trapped because they got used to obeying their own urges. They say, I just need to relax a little. I deserve this. I'll get back on track later. I'll restart tomorrow. But every small concession trains your mind to escape discipline. And a mind that escapes discipline slowly loses authority over your life. In that state, money won't save you. Success won't save you. Opportunity won't save you. Because when someone gains more money without gaining control over themselves, they just gain more power to lose direction. They buy more distractions. They feed more addictions. They justify more excess. And they turn blessings into burdens. So the real question is not, do you want to be successful? The real question is, do you have the mental structure to handle success without being consumed by it? Because wealth without self-control can become a trap. Pleasure without limits can become a prison. And desire without discipline can quietly lead you into a life of drift. In this video, you're going to understand how the most common desires, food, sex, money, comfort, and distraction, can be used against your own mind. You'll see why so many intelligent people remain stuck in cycles of excess, guilt, weakness, and restarting over and over again. And more importantly, you'll learn how to take back control before your appetites decide the direction of your life. Because in the end, there are only two possibilities. Either you govern your desires, or they govern you. The strategy of control, pleasure as a trap. What if the biggest threat to your life is not pain, but pleasure? That idea sounds strange at first, because most people are taught to fear struggle, to avoid discomfort, to escape anything that feels difficult. But Napoleon Hill revealed something most people never stop to question. Pain doesn't control people for long. Pleasure does. Pain creates resistance. Pleasure lowers it. And once your resistance is lowered, your mind becomes easier to influence, easier to shape, easier to control. That's the strategy. Control doesn't begin with force. It begins with seduction. No one needs to push you into a life of weakness if they can make you walk into it willingly. And that's exactly what happens when pleasure becomes unregulated. At first, it feels harmless. You eat a little more than you should. You scroll a little longer than you planned. You indulge a little more than necessary. You give in to distractions you said you would avoid. Nothing extreme, nothing alarming. But something subtle begins to change. Your standards start to lower. Your discipline starts to weaken. Your ability to say no starts to fade. And here's the dangerous part. You don't notice it. Because pleasure doesn't feel like a threat. It feels like relief. It feels like reward. It feels like something you deserve. And that's where the trap closes. The more you associate pleasure with relief, the more your mind starts to depend on it. And once dependence is created, control is no longer external. It becomes internal. You start negotiating with yourself. I'll just do this one more time. I'll stop tomorrow. I earned this. But every time you say that, you are not reinforcing your discipline. You are weakening it. You are training your mind to prioritize comfort over control, and over time, that becomes your default behavior. You stop choosing what is right, and start choosing what feels good in the moment. That's when the shift happens. You're no longer in control of your desires. Your desires are in control of you. And this doesn't just affect small habits. It affects everything. Your focus, your decisions, your energy, your direction in life. Because a mind that constantly seeks pleasure loses its tolerance for effort. And a mind that cannot tolerate effort cannot build anything meaningful. This is why so many people feel stuck. Not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack opportunity, but because they've trained themselves to avoid discomfort and chase immediate satisfaction. They've unknowingly conditioned their minds to reject discipline. And once that happens, even the simplest tasks start to feel heavy. Even the smallest commitments feel overwhelming. Even the clearest goals feel distant. Not because they are impossible, but because the mind has been weakened by excess. This is the real danger of uncontrolled pleasure. It doesn't destroy you all at once. It slowly erodes your ability to control yourself. And once self-control is gone, everything else begins to fall apart. That's why understanding this mechanism is critical. Because if you don't recognize how pleasure is shaping your behavior, you will keep repeating the same patterns while believing the problem is something else. But it's not. The problem is not lack of time. It's not lack of money. It's not lack of opportunity. The problem is lack of control. And in the next part, you're going to see how this loss of control becomes even more dangerous. When money enters the equation, money without preparation, the trap of sudden wealth money does not corrupt you. It reveals you. That's the part most people misunderstand. They believe money is the goal, the solution, the turning point that will finally fix everything. But money is not a solution. Money is an amplifier. It takes whatever is already inside you and multiplies it. If you have discipline, it expands your power. If you have confusion, it expands your chaos. If you have control, it gives you freedom. But if you lack control, it accelerates your downfall. This is exactly what Napoleon Hill exposes in that dialogue. The danger is not money itself. The danger is receiving money before developing the mindset to handle it. Because when someone suddenly gains access to wealth, without having built discipline first, they don't gain control. They lose it. Think about it. When you struggle for something, you are forced to develop structure. You learn restraint. You learn patience. You learn how to delay gratification. You build internal resistance. But when money comes easily, none of that is required. There is no pressure to control yourself. No need to say no. No need to think twice. Everything becomes available instantly. And that's where the collapse begins. Because without resistance, there is no growth. And without growth, there is no stability. This is why you see the same pattern repeated over and over again. People who inherit money lose it. People who rise too fast burn out. Celebrities, athletes, influencers, they go from nothing to everything. And then back to nothing again. Not because they weren't talented, but because they were not prepared. They had access without structure. And access without structure is dangerous because it removes the only thing that was keeping them grounded: limits. When there are no limits, your impulses expand. Your desires grow louder. Your need for stimulation increases. And slowly, you start consuming more than you can control. More pleasure, more distractions, more excess. And the worst part is, it feels like success. It feels like you finally made it. But in reality, you're losing control at a higher level. You're not building your life anymore. You're feeding your impulses. And this is where most people get trapped. Because from the outside, everything looks perfect. Money, freedom, access. But internally, discipline is collapsing. Focus is disappearing. Clarity is fading. And the person doesn't even realize it. Because the environment rewards the behavior. People praise it. Society normalizes it. Culture celebrates it. Enjoy your life. You deserve it. You worked for this, but no one talks about the cost. No one talks about what happens when indulgence becomes a habit. No one talks about what happens when pleasure replaces purpose. And that's when the shift becomes irreversible. Because once your identity becomes tied to consumption, you no longer know how to operate without it. You don't know how to sit in silence. You don't know how to focus deeply. You don't know how to delay gratification. You've lost the ability to be uncomfortable. And without that ability, you cannot evolve. That's why wealth, without preparation, becomes a trap. Not because money is evil, but because it removes friction. And friction is what builds strength. Take away friction, and you weaken the mind, and you increase vulnerability. And that's exactly when control becomes easy. Because a person who cannot control themselves can always be controlled by something else. And in the next part, you're going to understand what that something else is. The hidden forces that take advantage of a weakened mind and turn it into a cycle of dependency. Addictions. The entry points of control. Control doesn't happen all at once. It happens through repetition, through small behaviors repeated so many times that they stop feeling like choices and start feeling like needs. That's how addiction begins, not as something extreme, but as something ordinary, something familiar, something socially accepted, something that feels harmless. Napoleon Hill pointed directly to this. The main entry points of control are not complex. They are simple: food, sex, alcohol, stimulation, distraction. Things that, by themselves, are not the problem. The problem is not the existence of pleasure. A problem is dependence on it. Because the moment something becomes a necessity for your emotional state, it gains power over you. And once something has power over you, it can influence your behavior. Think about it carefully. If you can't go a day without certain types of stimulation, you are no longer in control of your attention. If you can't resist the urge to check, consume, indulge, your decisions are no longer fully yours. They are being guided by whatever gives you the fastest relief. And this is where the mechanism becomes dangerous, because addiction doesn't just affect behavior. It rewires your mind. Every time you give in to an impulse, you reinforce a pattern, a loop. Desire gives action, gives temporary relief, and your brain starts to memorize that sequence. It learns that discomfort should be escaped, not confronted. It learns that effort should be avoided, not embraced. It learns that pleasure is the answer to everything. And over time, this creates a person who cannot sit with pressure, who cannot tolerate boredom, who cannot stay focused, who cannot delay gratification. A person who needs constant stimulation just to feel normal. That's when control becomes effortless. Because now, you don't need to be forced into anything. You will choose it yourself. You will choose distraction over focus, pleasure over discipline, comfort over growth. Not because you are weak, but because you were conditioned. Conditioned to seek relief instead of strength. And this conditioning is subtle. It hides behind everyday habits. Scrolling when you should be thinking. Eating when you're not hungry. Seeking validation when you feel uncertain. Escaping discomfort instead of facing it. Each of these moments seems insignificant, but together, they shape your identity. They define how you respond to life. And here's the most important part. The more you depend on something, the easier it is to control you through it. If someone understands what you cannot resist, they don't need to control you directly. They just need to control access to what you crave. And that's how entire systems are built. Not by forcing behavior, but by feeding desire. Keeping you stimulated, keeping you distracted, keeping you dependent. Because a distracted mind is a controllable mind, and a dependent mind is a predictable mind. This is why so many people feel stuck. They're not lacking information. They're not lacking opportunity. They're trapped in loops. Loops of stimulation. Loops of escape. Loops of temporary relief. And as long as those loops continue, nothing changes, no matter how much they want to change. Because desire is stronger than intention when it has been reinforced long enough. That's why breaking this cycle is not just about willpower. It's about awareness, recognizing the patterns, interrupting the loops, rebuilding control. Because until you take back control of your impulses, you will keep living on autopilot, responding instead of choosing, reacting instead of directing. And in the next part, you're going to understand the real consequence of all of this. What happens to your mind when pleasure is no longer something you control, but something that controls you? How excess pleasure destroys your ability to think. The most dangerous effect of uncontrolled pleasure is not what it does to your habits. It's what it does to your mind. Because over time, excess doesn't just change what you do. It changes how you think. Napoleon Hill made this very clear. When a person becomes addicted to indulgence, their mental sharpness begins to decline, not suddenly, but gradually, almost invisibly. At first, it feels like nothing. You just feel a little more tired, a little less focused, a little less motivated. You tell yourself it's normal. You tell yourself you just need rest. But what's really happening is something deeper. Your mind is losing its edge because constant pleasure overstimulates your system. And when your system is constantly overstimulated, it loses sensitivity. What used to feel good no longer feels enough. What used to hold your attention no longer keeps you engaged. So you need more stimulation, more intensity, more distraction. And this creates a dangerous cycle because the more you consume, the less satisfied you feel. And the less satisfied you feel, the more you consume, until eventually, your baseline is no longer normal. Your baseline becomes excess. And this affects your thinking in a very specific way. Your mind becomes slower, not physically slower, but functionally slower. You take longer to focus. You struggle to stay present. You feel resistance when facing anything that requires effort. Deep thinking becomes uncomfortable. Silence becomes uncomfortable. Even doing nothing becomes uncomfortable. Because your brain has been trained to expect constant input, constant stimulation, constant reward. And without it, it starts to feel restless, agitated, empty. This is why so many people can't sit still anymore. Why they can't focus on one thing for long. Why they avoid tasks that require concentration. It's not because they are incapable. It's because their mind has been conditioned to operate at a shallow level, jumping from one stimulus to another, never going deep, never sustaining attention. And without sustained attention, you cannot build anything meaningful. You cannot develop mastery. You cannot think strategically. You cannot make clear decisions. Because clarity requires stillness, and stillness has become intolerable. This is the real consequence. A mind that once had potential becomes fragmented, scattered, easily distracted, easily influenced. Because when you lose the ability to think deeply, you also lose the ability to question, to analyze, to resist. And that's when external influence becomes stronger than internal direction. That's when you start following instead of leading, reacting instead of deciding, consuming instead of creating. And this doesn't just affect your productivity. It affects your identity, because over time, you start to see yourself as someone who can't focus, someone who can't stay consistent, someone who always starts and never finishes. But that's not who you are. That's who you became after training your mind to depend on stimulation. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to reverse, because now it's not just a habit. It's your default state. This is why so many people feel mentally exhausted, even when they're not doing anything meaningful. because their energy is being consumed by constant stimulation, not by purposeful effort. And without energy, there is no discipline. Without discipline, there is no control. And without control, everything else begins to collapse. In the next part, you're going to see where this leads. A moment when pleasure, success, and lack of control collide and create the most dangerous trap of all, the trap of success, when you win and start losing. The most dangerous moment in your life is not when you are struggling. It's when things start going well and you no longer feel pressure. Because pressure forces you to stay sharp. It forces you to think, to plan, to control yourself. But when success arrives, pressure disappears. And without pressure, most people don't maintain discipline. They relax. They reward themselves. They celebrate. They loosen their standards. And at first, it feels deserved. It feels like you finally made it. But this is where the hidden shift begins. Because success changes your environment. It gives you access. Access to more comfort, more options, more pleasure. And if you haven't built internal control before that moment, you won't manage that access. You will be consumed by it. This is why so many people rise and then fall. Not because they lost opportunity, but because they lost structure. They stopped doing the things that built their success. They stopped controlling their time. They stopped protecting their focus. They stopped delaying gratification. And slowly, their identity begins to change. They move from being builders to being consumers, from disciplined to indulgent, from focused to distracted. And here's the most dangerous part. It doesn't feel like failure. It feels like freedom. Because now they can do whatever they want. But that's the illusion. Doing whatever you want is not freedom. Being able to control what you want is. And most people never develop that level of control. So when they gain freedom, they don't use it wisely. They use it impulsively. They start chasing stimulation, buying more, consuming more, indulging more. And every time they do, they weaken their ability to say no. Until eventually, they don't even try anymore. This is when success becomes a trap. Because now, everything that once required effort can be replaced with comfort. Instead of building, you relax. Instead of growing, you maintain. Instead of pushing forward, you stay where it's easy. And slowly, momentum disappears. Ambition fades. Clarity gets lost. Not because success destroyed you, but because it removed the structure that was protecting you. And without structure, your impulses take over. You start making decisions based on how you feel instead of what you know is right. And feelings are unstable. They change constantly. They chase comfort. They avoid effort. They seek immediate reward. And when your life is guided by that, you lose direction. That's why so many people who made it end up feeling empty, lost, disconnected, because they reached a level of external success without building internal stability. And without internal stability, nothing holds. Everything becomes temporary. That's the real trap. You don't fall because you failed. You fall because you stopped doing what kept you strong. And the moment you stop reinforcing discipline, your mind naturally drifts toward indulgence. That's the default. That's the pull. And resisting that pull is what separates those who sustain success from those who lose it. In the next part, you're going to see one of the most powerful forces behind this entire process. A force so strong that it has the ability to either elevate your life or completely destroy your focus. Depending on how you use it, sexual energy, the most powerful force, and the most misused, there is one force that can either elevate your entire life or completely destroy your focus. And most people have no idea how to handle it. Sexual energy. Napoleon Hill didn't avoid this subject. He confronted it directly. Because he understood something most people ignore. Sex is not just physical. It is mental. It is emotional. It is energetic. And when it is not controlled, it becomes one of the strongest sources of distraction in a person's life. This is where things get serious, because sexual desire is natural. It's powerful. It's part of human nature. But power without direction becomes chaos. And that's exactly what happens when this energy is misused. Instead of being channeled, it is consumed. Instead of being controlled, it is indulged. And every time that happens, your focus weakens. Your discipline weakens. Your clarity weakens. Because your mind becomes conditioned to seek instant gratification, to chase stimulation, to prioritize pleasure over purpose. And once that pattern is established, it spreads. It doesn't stay limited to one area of your life. It affects everything. Your work, your consistency, your ability to stay committed to long-term goals. Because now, your brain is trained to look for the fastest reward, not the most meaningful one. And this is where most people lose without realizing it. They don't see it as a problem, because it's normalized. It's everywhere. Constant stimulation, constant exposure, constant temptation. And because it's so accessible, it becomes easy to overconsume. But here's the truth most people avoid. The more you indulge without control, the less control you have over yourself. You become reactive. You lose mental sharpness. You lose direction. You lose intensity. And slowly, your ambition starts to fade, because ambition requires focus, and focus requires discipline. And discipline cannot exist in a mind that is constantly seeking stimulation. This is why some of the most capable people never reach their full potential, not because they lack talent, but because their energy is scattered, divided, pulled in different directions by constant desire. They start something and lose interest. They set goals and get distracted. They feel motivated and then suddenly lose momentum. And they don't understand why. But the reason is simple. Their energy is not under control. And energy that is not controlled cannot be directed. And energy that cannot be directed cannot produce results. That's why mastering this area of your life is not optional. It's essential, because when you learn to control this force, everything changes. Your focus becomes stronger. Your presence becomes sharper. Your discipline becomes natural. You stop chasing and start directing. You stop reacting and start deciding. And this is where true power begins. Not when you eliminate desire, but when you control it. Not when you suppress energy, but when you channel it. Because the same force that can distract you can also drive you. The same energy that can weaken you can also elevate you. It all depends on one thing: control. And in the next part, you're going to see how all these elements connect and form a cycle that keeps people stuck without them even realizing it. The cycle of alienation. How people lose themselves without realizing it. No one wakes up one day and decides to lose control of their life. It doesn't happen like that. It happens slowly, silently, through a pattern that repeats itself over and over again until it becomes your normal. This is the cycle most people are trapped in, and the reason they don't escape it is because they don't even see it. It starts with a simple desire, a need for relief, a need for comfort, a need to feel good. Nothing extreme, just something small, something harmless. So you give in, you consume, you indulge, you escape. And for a moment, it works. You feel better, lighter, relaxed, distracted from whatever was bothering you. But that relief is temporary, because the real problem was never solved. It was only avoided. And what is avoided doesn't disappear. It accumulates. So after the relief fades, something else appears. A subtle drop in energy, a lack of motivation, a sense of heaviness. And now, you don't feel like doing what needs to be done. You procrastinate, you delay, you push things forward. And that creates pressure. Because now, responsibilities are piling up. Decisions are being postponed. Opportunities are being ignored. And the more this builds, the more uncomfortable you feel. And here's where the cycle tightens. Instead of facing that discomfort, you look for relief again. You go back to what made you feel better before. More distraction, more pleasure, more escape. And the loop continues. Desire, indulgence, temporary relief, energy drop, avoidance, pressure, escape, again and again and again, until something changes. Your identity, because after repeating this cycle long enough, you stop seeing it as a phase. You start seeing it as who you are. I'm just not disciplined. I always procrastinate. I can't stay consistent. But that's not the truth. That's the result of the pattern. You weren't born that way. You became that way by reinforcing this cycle over time. And the more you repeat it, the stronger it gets. The more automatic it becomes, until eventually, you don't even question it anymore. You just follow it. And that's when the loss of control becomes complete. Because now, you are not choosing your actions consciously. You are reacting automatically, driven by desire, guided by discomfort, controlled by the need for relief. And a person who lives like that cannot build anything stable, because stability requires consistency. And consistency cannot exist inside a cycle of escape. This is why so many people feel stuck, not because they lack ambition, but because they are trapped in a loop that constantly resets their progress. They start, they stop, they restart, over and over again. And every time they restart, they feel like they are moving forward. But in reality, they are staying in the same place, because the cycle never breaks. And as long as the cycle remains, nothing truly changes. That's the hard truth. You don't need more motivation. You don't need more information. You need to break the pattern. Because once the pattern is broken, everything changes. Your energy returns. Your focus stabilizes. Your decisions become clearer. And for the first time, you stop reacting and start directing your life. In the next part, you're going to understand something even deeper. Why intelligence alone is not enough to escape this cycle. And why even the smartest people fall into it. Why intelligent people still fall into the trap. Intelligence does not protect you from losing control. In many cases, it makes the fall more subtle. Because intelligent people don't just act on impulse. They justify it. They explain it. They rationalize it. They create convincing arguments for behaviors that are slowly weakening them. That's what makes this so dangerous. Because when someone lacks awareness, they fall quickly. But when someone is intelligent, they fall slowly, while believing they are still in control. They don't say, "I'm losing discipline." They say, "I just need a break." They don't say, "I'm escaping." They say, "I deserve this." They don't say, "I'm being controlled by my impulses." They say, "I'm choosing this." And that distinction changes everything. Because now the problem is hidden, covered by logic, protected by reasoning, defended by identity. And the smarter the person is, the better they become at creating these justifications. They can explain why they are not focused. They can defend why they are inconsistent. They can normalize why they are indulging. But explanation is not transformation. Understanding something intellectually does not mean you have control over it. And this is where many intelligent people get trapped. They know what they should do. They understand discipline. They understand focus. They understand delayed gratification, but they don't apply it consistently, because knowledge without execution creates an illusion of progress. You feel like you're improving just because you understand more, but your behavior doesn't change. Your patterns don't change. Your results don't change. And over time, this creates frustration, because now you can't blame ignorance. You know better, but you're not doing better. And that gap between knowing and doing is where most intelligent people suffer, because they expect themselves to act differently, but they keep repeating the same patterns. And to reduce that discomfort, they justify it. They soften the truth. They say, "It's not that serious. I'll fix it later. I just need more time." But the reality is simple. If your behavior doesn't change, nothing changes, no matter how much you understand, no matter how aware you think you are. Because control is not built through knowledge. It's built through action, through repetition, through discipline, through consistent decisions that go against your immediate desires. And this is what separates those who stay stuck from those who break free. It's not intelligence. It's execution. It's the ability to act even when you don't feel like it, to choose discipline, even when pleasure is available, to stay focused, even when distraction is easier. And that's why intelligence alone is not enough, because intelligence can guide you, but it cannot control you. Only discipline can do that. Only structure can do that. Only repeated action can do that. And in the next part, you're going to see how to rebuild that control, step by step, not through theory, but through practical changes that restore your authority over your own mind. Taking back control, rebuilding discipline, step-by-step awareness is the beginning. But it is not enough, because seeing the problem does not solve the problem. You can understand everything about discipline and still live without it. You can recognize every pattern and still repeat it. So the real question is not, do you understand this? The real question is, are you willing to change how you act? Because control is not something you feel. It's something you build through structure, through repetition, through decisions that go against your impulses. And it starts with something very simple, but very uncomfortable. Reducing excess, not eliminating everything. Not becoming extreme, but creating limits. Because without limits, there is no control. If you allow yourself to consume anything, anytime, your mind will always choose what is easiest, what is fastest, what is most pleasurable. So the first step is restriction, not as punishment, but as training. You begin to say no, even when you could say yes. You stop before excess, even when you want more. You create space between desire and action, and that space is where control begins. The second step is awareness of triggers. You need to identify what pulls you out of control. What situations lead you to distraction? What emotions lead you to indulgence? What environments weaken your discipline? Because if you don't recognize the trigger, you will always fall into the same pattern. Control is not just internal. It's also environmental. The places you go, the content you consume, the people you are around, all of these shape your behavior. So if your environment constantly stimulates excess, your mind will struggle to stay disciplined. That's why changing your environment is not optional. It's strategic. The third step is replacing, not removing. Because if you only try to eliminate habits, you create a void, and that void will be filled by the same patterns again. So instead of just removing distraction, you replace it with intention. Instead of scrolling, you read. Instead of escaping, you think. Instead of consuming, you create. You redirect your energy instead of suppressing it. And this is critical, because suppression creates tension, but redirection creates control. The fourth step is building consistency, not intensity. Most people try to change everything at once. They go from excess to extreme discipline, and it doesn't last because it's not sustainable. Control is not built in one decision. It's built in repeated decisions, small ones, daily ones, decisions that seem insignificant, but compound over time. Saying no when it's easy to say yes, stopping when you want more, focusing when you feel like escaping. These moments are where discipline is built, not in motivation, not in inspiration, but in repetition. And over time, something shifts. Your mind stops resisting discipline and starts expecting it. What once felt difficult becomes normal. What once required effort becomes automatic. And that's when you regain control, not because you forced yourself once, but because you trained yourself consistently. And this is the truth most people avoid. You don't need a new strategy. You need a new standard. A standard for how you act, for what you tolerate, for what you allow into your life. Because your life will always reflect your standards, not your intentions, not your knowledge, not your desires, your standards. And once you raise that standard, everything begins to change. Your focus sharpens. Your energy stabilizes. Your decisions become aligned. And most importantly, you stop negotiating with yourself. You stop asking, "Do I feel like it?" And you start deciding, "This is who I am." And in the next part, you're going to see how to take this even deeper. How to reprogram your identity. So discipline is no longer something you try to do, but something you naturally become. Identity reprogramming. From forced discipline to natural control. Most people try to change their behavior without changing who they believe they are. And that's why nothing lasts. Because behavior that is not aligned with identity always breaks under pressure. You can force yourself to act disciplined for a few days, maybe a few weeks. But if deep down you still see yourself as someone inconsistent, someone distracted, someone who struggles with discipline, you will eventually return to that pattern. Not because you failed, but because you stayed the same. This is where real transformation begins, not with action, but with identity. Because your identity defines your standards, and your standards define your actions. So if you want to change your life, you cannot just change what you do. You have to change who you are. And this is not about pretending. It's about rebuilding, consciously, intentionally. You stop saying, "I'm trying to be disciplined," and you start saying, "I am disciplined." You stop saying, "I'm working on my focus," and you start saying, "I am focused." That shift might seem small, but it changes everything, because now you're not acting based on effort. You're acting based on identity. And when something becomes part of your identity, you no longer negotiate with it. You don't ask, "Do I feel like doing this?" You ask, "What would someone like me do?" And the answer becomes clear. A disciplined person doesn't wait for motivation. A focused person doesn't chase distraction. A controlled mind doesn't follow every impulse. So the process becomes simpler, not easier, but clearer. You align your actions with the person you've decided to become. And every time you act in alignment, you reinforce that identity. You strengthen it. You make it more real. And every time you act against it, you weaken it. That's why consistency matters so much. Because identity is built through repetition, not intention, not desire, repetition. The things you do daily become who you are. And once that identity is solid, discipline changes. It stops feeling like resistance and starts feeling like integrity. You're no longer forcing yourself. You're just being yourself. And this is where control becomes natural, because now you don't rely on willpower. You rely on standards. You rely on structure. You rely on identity, and identity is stable. It doesn't change based on mood. It doesn't disappear when things get hard. It holds. That's the difference, because most people try to fight their impulses without changing the system behind them. But once the system changes, the impulses lose strength. You don't eliminate desire. You just stop being controlled by it. And that's real power. Not the absence of temptation, but the ability to remain stable in its presence, to stay focused, even when distraction is available, to stay disciplined, even when indulgence is easy, to stay aligned, even when no one is watching. And that level of control changes everything, because now your life is no longer reactive. It becomes intentional, directed, built, and in the final part, you're going to bring all of this together. One principle, one decision. That defines whether you take control of your life or remain controlled by your desires. At the end of everything you've heard, all the concepts, all the patterns, all the explanations, it comes down to one principle, one decision, one line that separates two completely different lives. Either you control your desires, or your desires control you. There is no middle ground. There is no balance where you lose control, just a little, and somehow stay in charge. Because control is not partial, it's directional. You are either moving toward discipline or drifting toward indulgence, and drifting is easy. It requires no effort, no intention, no awareness. You don't need to choose distraction. You just stop choosing focus. You don't need to choose weakness. You just stop reinforcing strength. And slowly, without realizing it, you give up control, not in one moment, but in small decisions, repeated daily, ignored, justified, until they become your life. That's how people lose years, not through one big mistake, but through consistent small concessions. Saying yes when they should say no, stopping when they should continue, escaping when they should confront. And each of these moments feels insignificant, but together they define everything. Because your life is not shaped by what you do once. It's shaped by what you tolerate consistently. And if you tolerate distraction, you will live distracted. If you tolerate excess, you will live in excess. If you tolerate lack of discipline, you will live without control. That's the reality. Not comfortable, not easy to accept, but real. And the moment you truly understand this, something changes. You stop negotiating. You stop making excuses. You stop waiting to feel ready, because you realize something simple. Every moment is a decision. Every decision is a direction. And every direction leads somewhere. So the question is no longer, do I feel like doing this? The question becomes, who is in control right now? Is it your mind or your impulses? Is it your intention or your desire for relief? Is it your discipline or your need for comfort? Because whatever is in control in that moment is shaping your future, not your goals, not your plans, your actions. And your actions are always decided in the present. That's where everything happens. That's where control is won or lost. And the truth is, no one is coming to take control for you. No opportunity will fix it. No amount of money will fix it. No external change will fix it, because control is internal. And if you don't build it, you will always be influenced by something that did. That's why this is not just about discipline. It's about freedom, real freedom, the ability to direct your own life, to act with intention, to stay aligned under pressure, to move forward regardless of how you feel. Because when you have that, nothing can control you. Not pleasure, not distraction, not impulse. And without that, everything can. So from this point forward, the choice becomes clear. Not easy, but clear. Either you take control, or you remain under control, and that decision is made in the smallest moments of your day, over and over again, until it becomes who you are. Now you see it, not as an idea, but as a pattern. The distractions, the impulses, the small concessions, how they build up, how they repeat, how they slowly take control without you even noticing. And the truth is, this was never about information. You already knew most of this. You felt it. You've lived it. The real difference now is awareness, because once you see the pattern clearly, you can no longer pretend it's not there. And that's where the decision begins. Not tomorrow, not next week. Now, in the way you respond to the next impulse, the next distraction, the next moment where it would be easier to escape than to stay in control. That's where everything changes. Not in big, dramatic actions, but in small, quiet decisions that no one else sees. When you choose focus instead of distraction, when you choose discipline instead of comfort, when you choose long-term direction instead of short-term relief, that's when you start rebuilding control. That's when your identity begins to shift. That's when your life starts to move in a different direction. Because control is not something you achieve once. It's something you practice daily, moment by moment, decision by decision. And the more you practice it, the stronger it becomes. Until one day, what once felt difficult becomes natural. What once required effort becomes automatic. And you realize you're no longer reacting to life. You're directing it. So if this message connected with you, don't ignore it. Act on it right now, before the momentum fades, before the returns. Take one decision and make it differently. Choose control. And if you're serious about building that kind of mindset, type this in the comments. I choose control. Because that simple act is more than a comment. It's a declaration, a shift in identity, a commitment to yourself. If this video made you think differently, leave a like. It helps this message reach more people who are stuck in the same cycle without even realizing it. Subscribe to the channel if you want more content like this, content that challenges you, that sharpens your mind, that pushes you to become stronger, more focused, more disciplined. And share this with someone who needs to hear this. Because most people are not lacking potential. They're lacking control. And once control is built, everything else follows. Now it's your move. Control or be controlled.